We hope you enjoyed this film at LACMA screening of Is That Black Enough for You? My name is Dr. Neal Lester, and I'm a professor of English here at Arizona State University, and I also direct a university initiative called Project Humanities. And I am very excited to have this conversation with director Elvis Mitchell about this documentary. Elvis, nice to see you and meet you.
Nice to see you and meet you as well. And,
Yeah.
English is a language I almost speak, so I'm thrilled to be doing this with you.
Well, I'm not a linguist, but I do in culture. So a lot of what I saw and experienced in this documentary aligns with what my office looks like here and the stuff that I teach. So thank you for the documentary, and I'll start in talking about what I found in watching this in terms of being able to cover so much. You show us, you force us, invite us to ponder, to hear and see. But from the movie clips and the commentaries, the documentary has a little bit of everything for everybody. My question to you at this first part of the conversation is, in this George Floyd murder moment nationally and globally, why this documentary, and why this documentary now from you?
Gosh, because we've unfortunately seen that kind of moment so many times. I think, as I say at one point in the documentary, there are race riots, insurrections in this country every decade. At some point, there's some eruption of violence over mistreatment, over that kind of social chasm that exists between those of us in color and those who exercise power in institutions.
Mm-hmm.
And this movie deals with some of that. And I think for that moment to remain as powerful as it should, and to, I hope, be a fulcrum for the kind of change that it should be, I think this movie is sort of really fits in with that. I mean, and again, as you know, so much of Black culture has been about responding to beats of violence. You've got that poster for colored girls, and it's about
Yes.
violence, and violence that we inflict upon each other, and the roots of that violence, and how it's bigger than just being contained in those neighborhoods. So this is a conversation I think you and I could have probably every day for the rest of our lives.
Well, and the fact that we have somehow normalized it as a culture means that there's an urgency to revisit it, to rethink it, and to re-challenge people, especially in the context, as I see this, the way you position this around dreams and the ways in which your grandmother was, at least as I see it, a framing of this notion of dreams and movies. Tell us a little bit about your grandmother and why her words frame this for you. What was she like? Why and how do her words about movies and dreams move, inspire, and challenge you professionally and personally? So I want to hear about your mother.
That's such a great question, because what she did and was basically make me ask questions about where I stood in the world, and with all my family, all my sisters and my brother. That's what she did. And it's weird, because she would say, yeah, there's some writer who lives down the street, I guess. And, she was 3 miles away from the Faulkner house. So but it didn't register for her in that way. But
Mm-hmm.
she brought an enormous amount of common sense to the world. And just remember, like, sitting around one of those miserable hot summers in Hattiesburg with nothing to do, because it's always hot and there's never anything to do. And just
Except sweat.
Oh,
Right.
God, yes,
Yeah.
yes. In fact, sweat became what did you do last night? Oh, we sweat. How much did you sweat? Oh, my God, my shoes are soaking. I go squeaking when I went to take my shower. Or bath, because they were in the shower.
Sweating and batting mosquitoes. Yes.
Oh.
Sweating and batting mosquitoes. And sometimes
Batting mosquitoes, playing cards with mosquitoes. I don't know where you were, but they were too
Yes.
big to try to swat down, or
Right.
trying to stay away from the snakes.
Right.
And she would just say these things like, well, you can't watch this show because there's no Black people. It's got to be set in a place like this. Doesn't it make you wonder? And I just, and that actually became this sort of catalyst for me for critical thinking. Because what is critical thinking? Except asking questions about things that aren't there, right? You as well as anybody know this.
Yes.
And I think in some crucial way that this material really forced me to examine. She became the prism through which I view the world, the lenses, if you will, through which I view the world. And so often these kinds of things she would say, what she talked about, that she wasn't a big pop culture entertainment fan. She was too busy trying to run the farm.
Right.
And she didn't see many movies because she kind of thought they were nonsense. But she was old enough, she was a teenager when she saw her first movie, and old enough to realize that movies changed the way her dreams were shaped. And
Yes.
I had never had anybody say that to me before or since. But you think about that, and people of color, we have to, because these dreams we're seeing on the screen so often don't reflect us in any way. Yet they still seep into our subconscious. They still seep into the ways we think about ourselves, the way we present ourselves into the world. And we're absent from this. Then what does that do for us? What is that kind of power of of abnegation, which becomes then self-abnegation, do? And then that's so much of the way I think as a critic and now as a filmmaker, is to say, try to find a way, in this case, to literally pose these questions to the medium.
Well, and it's interesting that the timing, because I'm struck by the timing of things. I don't think things happen sort of arbitrarily, but I could see this as your documentary, which again is full of so many commentaries about history, about politics, about culture, about how those intersect, that there's something about this that feels like it is deliberately anti-racist. And that when you sort of move to this moment of saying this moves beyond cultural appropriation, this is about cultural colonization, then that seems to embody this moment that we're still pushing against to get people to recognize, first of all, that racism exists and that it is not some figment of our imagination. So in many ways, at least to me, it feels like the documentary is a response to your grandmother's comments about dreams. As you're saying, we know that we exist, even though we're not in those early movies that you cite at the very beginning that have Black in the title, but no Black people in them. And then when Black people come in, that's when the representation and the misrepresentation sort of take off. And we know we're not those Black people. We are different Black people. So your grandmother seems to be, and I'll add this too, not only are we fellow Southerners, I'm from Georgia, so I know about mosquitoes. Athens, well, close to Athens, Georgia.
Oh, you're from a city. Oh, well, congratulations.
Well, actually, notice I said close to Athens, Georgia. I did not say Athens. Okay, I said close. But I was also had a very, very special relationship with my grandmother, who mostly raised me, and so much of my view of the world is based on having grown up in a matriarchal household where it was normal to see women doing all kinds of things well. And I applaud you also for making space for women in your documentary, because too often these documentaries and movements can be very male centric. So why, and for those who have seen it, talk to us about why that was important to make sure that women are visible and present and important to the story that you are telling.
That's exactly it, because they are visible and present and important to this story. And my gosh, I mean, my grandmother raised my father by herself and ran a farm by herself. So I saw what determination, but also dealing with the mundane in a really sort of strictly professional manner can do for you. That she used to say that, hard work won't kill you. It may make you wish you were dead, but it will not kill you. And I took that away from her. And just, I also grew up in a house with 6 sisters, and they were so often the way I would hear about these things. I mentioned at one point in the movie that my older sister's boyfriends would talk about Night of the Living Dead, and this
Yes.
guy had to sacrifice himself for these white people, he'd still be
Yes.
around. That
Yes.
that became a line between Stokely Carmichael and Dr. King.
Right.
And that also that movie is about. It's really about seeing the riots sort of boil down, and clearly in ways that are intentional, but lots of ways that are unintentional. And so, I mean, I know what it's like to sort of. I was raised as much by my sisters as by my mother, because my mother's raising 9 kids. My dad was off working 2 full-time jobs. So having women in my life, I mean, I can't imagine not making that part of the story, but also trying to reflect on their achievements in ways that hadn't been done before. When I met Suzanne DePass about 30 years ago, I was the first person to tell her, because nobody ever mentioned to her before, she was the first Black woman, and at that point, only Black woman to be nominated for a screenplay Academy Award. She said, wait, is that true? And then it's only 5 years ago that Dee Reese is nominated, but in another category for adaptation. So to this point, Suzanne DePass is still the only Black woman to be nominated for Best Original Screenplay. I mean, so is that a shocking achievement to note in 2022? Yeah. was I, and the fact is, I was not afraid to make this kind of note because I thought, what's the likelihood of that changing?
Right.
And to pay tribute to these women and what they brought to these movies. And I was lucky enough to know Toni Morrison, who we were
Mm.
at dinner, and when this is going to be a book, and she said, "I'll write the introduction." I actually started looking around the room and said, "Who walked in here that you're talking to? You can't be talking to me."
Oh my gosh.
And she was an enormous aficionado and student of popular culture, and we just started talking about this. She just went into this thing about badass is such a reductive way to do this. First of all, saying that she wants to live her life like a man and missing the point of being a woman. You can't lead your life
Hmm.
like a man.
Right.
It so misunderstands what that character is and demeans her performance. And she started
Hmm.
talking, so I'm grabbing napkins off the table, write some
I'm
of this
trying to
down
write stuff down,
to
right?
remember it. And it's just this oh my gosh, this sulfurous sort of onslaught about the way women are sort of depicted in media about their performance in movies. They're missing the point of what she does. They don't even call her an actor. They're calling her badass as if that's what
Mm-hmm.
black women are supposed to be.
Hmm.
Or she said at this point that was just another archetype, another way to
Hmm.
reduce the black woman experience. I just thought, yeah, you're right.
Well, and that aligns to so much of what was happening on the stage too. I recall is the superwoman myth, but we also
Which Michelle Wallace wrote about,
yes,
and
absolutely, and this whole notion of having be this sort of superhuman meant also in terms of black men that you could also be killed for that. And I think about Mike Brown allegedly walking through bullets as Darian Wilson was shooting him and that whole sort of animalization that one might find in or does find that sort of white supremacy in King Kong just sort of bears that out as well.
or Planet of the Apes,
Or any,
what else we
yes.
can do. I mean, yes, and it's the reason I want to include that sequence from the Learning Tree, just because I think that's a moment in film history that doesn't get its due.
Hmm.
It's the first time something like that is shown. You see the sheer impotence of those boys standing around, and Gordon Parks framed it like it's one of his WPA shots. It could be one of those black and white shots he took in the
Right,
30s. I mean, it's a beautiful piece of framing, and you just see this sweaty ogre of a white sheriff just
yep,
basically saying that's what they get, that's what they deserve.
yep,
He doesn't have to use racial epithets. It's so
right.
clear what he's saying, and just in the way those boys are positioned. And I got to ask him. He said one of the reasons I wanted to make this movie, and I wrote that book, and I wanted to
Hmm.
make this movie is so this kind of thing that never gets dealt with in popular culture can be
Right,
dealt with, and that's
right,
why it was key to me to include that moment because it's
right,
as shocking as anything.
right,
And in fact, there's such a powerful moment. The movie doesn't quite recover from it.
right. Well, it's interesting though, because that, in sort of fast forwarding to how we experience movies in terms of what we now call Black trauma, has the industry sort of evolved to a place where that violence against Black bodies has become so normalized that it's not as surprising as perhaps it was when we see Trayvon Martin or we see Ahmaud Arbery or we hear about Breonna Taylor or we watch. I mean, it goes on and on and on. What is there about movies as you see it and as a director that sort of sees the place of violence that doesn't become, trauma porn?
I mean, part of it is I think a creator exercising his option to humanize these people, so they
Hmm.
aren't just archetypes or stick
Okay.
figures to be picked off. That
Hmm.
you can see the suffering in those boys' faces, having
Right.
watched their friend, who wasn't even a good kid, who was the
Right.
bully of the group, and he still sacrificed
Right.
in the most blithe way possible. And that sheriff does everything but sort of like smack his hands, wipe off the dust as he walks away,
Right.
and also to put him in that ill-fitting outfit. I mean, just as to say that the normal ways we see white power exercise in movies, where it's somebody who looks like a superhuman in their police uniform. That's the way a lot of cops look in general. That this person who wouldn't scare you unless he was dressed like that and had a badge on. I mean, God, I actually flashed on that when I saw Herschel Walker flashing that badge at the
Oh
debate the other day. And
gosh.
I thought, this
Yes.
is the same
Yes.
badge that's so often been an object of fear for people of color. For him to try to do that with no context. Anyway, clearly
Well,
there's a whole lot we can talk about here.
well, because
But
your documentary is bringing up all of that. That's what I said. It has everything. It can be exactly what you're saying. It's not only documentation of past, But for me, it becomes a documentation of, and a documentary about what is present in this, what we thought was past. Because you're absolutely right. That flashing of the badge just reminds me of the overseers, the slave codes, and the ways in which Black people were also utilized by white patriarchy in order to corral other and keep other Black folks. And, somehow you were the good N word because you were in with the man, and therefore you could move things in ways that they couldn't. I also want to, because there's so many of these wonderful themes and tropes. I'm just going to give you a couple of, well, not a couple, but a few of these. And I want you to just give me a response to it. So sort of a free association based on your documentary. Okay.
Sure.
All right. So self-pitying, and this is all about Black representation, self-pitying. Just give me a free association with that relative to what you just did in your documentary.
I mean, so much of, to that end, so much of what we saw in film for a long time was about this kind of martyrdom of Black characters who pitied themselves because that was the only real agency they had was self-pity. They weren't allowed to exercise any power or make any choice. So the only way they could achieve any kind of dramatic actualization was through self-pity, which becomes a defining moment, which is to say, it becomes this whole kind of institutionalization of victimhood, doesn't it?
Black sexuality.
Well, what I was hoping to do with this is to sort of take away the fetishization that so much Black sexuality has in movies and in imagery. I mean, so much is about this kind of thoughtless, licentious quality that's described to people who, again, with no agency. The only agency they have is through their bodies, through violence or sexuality. And that you can make a free choice to be with somebody of color. In Chester Himes' terrific novel, Cotton Comes to Harlem, and which Ossie Davis brings to the screen so beautifully, you can sort of see the schism because there was so much anger in Chester Himes, who, by the way, at one point was a studio publicist who had Jack Warner say such vile and racist things to him that he moved to Paris for 20 years. And that's where he wrote all those books. So we kind of owe Chester Himes as a crime novelist to Jack Warner being a racist. But that scene in the book is kind of, there's this anger that you can always see Himes wrestling with. And what Ossie Davis does is make it folkloric and deal with the way that Black people were sexualized and fetishized on screen and literally turn the tables on it. And to me, that is so much of what these movies are doing by adding another dimension. So often it's not Black people got to be at least two-dimensional as compared to one-dimensional. then it brings a whole other set of feelings to the fore.
Well, I love how you make that point of saying if you have an interracial couple on, then that's sort of adult entertainment. And then if you get two Blacks on the screen, oh my God. I mean, it's like these sort of things that we would take for granted, but for those who are creating these films and those who are watching the films, there's a whole lot of stuff that's created that you may not intend to create that is there. One final one here is Black, or let's do this one, white angst/fear. White angst/fear.
Well, and in this context, it's so much about what you were just saying, the idea of a Black presence that's not self-pitying, that hasn't been reduced to physical desires or pursuit of these physical desires. A Black person standing on their own 2 feet, inhabiting a world that makes sense to us, becomes this thing that sort of creates angst. And there's so much of what movies were until this period were about that white angst. And by putting the Black person, so often you see, and then in these clips we have in the film, the Black person is in the corner of the frame. They're so rarely center frame. And this fear of the unknown, what Chuck, what he obviously called, fear of a black planet, what Chuck D called that, it's that. And so much of the angst comes from this abstraction of what Black presence is that's perpetuated by so many of these films. And so much of what I hope this movie does is not even offer answers so much as get people to ask questions about why this happened. At one point I said, and this is pretty much based on research, that, rather than make movies for Black audiences who were here, the studios would go to Germany. It had to be kicked out by the Nazis.
Yeah.
So the black dollar is so devalued. If that's not about white angst and that sort of fear of that, I don't know what it is. I mean, I've been asked this, and one of the great moments for me is, and my editor found this, is that scene of Dr. King
Mm-hmm.
talking about going to a movie 2 or 3 years later.
Mm-hmm.
As a person of color, at a certain age from the South, as you know,
Mm-hmm.
so many of those quote unquote movie theaters, just old buildings, old warehouses or stores. I was just talking to somebody about this. There's a sequence we end up cutting from the movie that I talked about my grandmother in one of the handful of times she went to a movie having to leave because they stopped the movie because there was a bat in the theater.
Right. Right. Well, and Du Bois talks about that in Souls of Black Folks, right?
Oh, dear God in heaven.
Jim Crow, in the
yes.
Jim Crow
Well, again,
car.
but James Baldwin talks about that too.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I am not your Negro. So talk to us a little bit about that title though, because I asked you at the very beginning, where do you want the emphasis in that punctuation that you give us? So give me I recognize the line in the documentary, but I want to know what your thinking is, because that was pretty bold to ask a question that's not really a question, that could be a statement. What is it to you?
I really think it's that thing that Lawrence Fishburne says, that line morphs, and it really is something that takes on a different kind of import in the mouth of the beholder, if I can mix a metaphor here.
Mm-hmm.
And is that black enough for you? 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 I mean, I think it's that thing that's both declamatory and interrogatory, which is so much about what the black experience is. That it's not just one thing, and and I have to say this: that was Steven Soderbergh's idea for that title.
Oh, really? Okay.
Said, because no, that's your title, because it does so much. And I just thought, I heard that, and I thought about the Billy Paul song, then the Schoolie D version of the Billy Paul song, and how that question really comes out of Stokely Carmichael and Huey Newton asking that question, and it was as much of a dare to white angst as it was to a question of self-identity for people of color. So it really is this thing that I feel has a different weight for everybody who speaks it, and I think it's such a great way to sort of get people. Oh, well, what is it? Because you hear the title and you think you know what the movie is.
Yes. And then you pull that and say it's not quite that. Well, that's why it's interesting that the audience that is there's sort of multiple audiences simultaneously. Is that black enough for you? Is that black enough for you? But who is the you? And notice that within black communities, and I'll say black communities, there's still this measuring stick about what's black enough. And you and I both know, and I don't know you, but I know you. We have been accused of talking white, of sounding white, if we made our subjects and verbs agree, and that somehow, if we do make our subjects and verbs agree, then we are articulate. Whereas the expectation, and that's exceptional, whereas the expectation is that white people will be, that's inherently what whiteness translates to. Your film sort of tries to challenge those notions of what it means to be articulate in terms of cultural competency. Would you agree?
I hope so. I mean, just because there's a question that not only that is posed by us to us, but you get the odd sort of, I'm not sure what adjective to use, but let's just say white person would say, to try to talk about your blackness to you, is that they somehow had some measuring stick of what it is. And the fact is that it's not concrete.
Right.
But it is this thing that you experience just because by virtue of being a person of color in this country, just the way you're depicted. And it's that line that ends the movie that Pointe talks about, that difference between who you think you are and the way others perceive you. And that becomes and that distance becomes much bigger for a person of color. And that's just, I mean, and for him to have said that, you do that better than anybody. So absolutely, I have to include that for that reason.
Well, I want you to sort of comment on this, because I could have used this, although maybe it would have been a hopeless audience. I was on a talk show recently, and I tried to talk about cultural appropriation, and I was so pleased that you talk about cultural appropriation, having moved from just cultural appropriation to cultural colonialism. Was that something that you came up with in the process of doing that, or you knew that from the very beginning when you were putting these documentaries or these film pieces together?
Oh, I knew that there's going to be in there just because it's kind of unavoidable, as you know. I mean, and
Hmm.
it exists, and it's this sort of thing that so often people are defensive about.
Oh my
So,
gosh.
so
That's an
just to give a
understatement.
show, I mean, concrete examples. I mean, there's this in the montage that begins the movie. A character is saying,
Hmm.
"I'm giving out hard times and bubblegum. I'm fresh out of bubblegum." Now that comes from a black movie. How many white films have you seen that line quoted in? I mean, it's been in Quentin Tarantino movies. It's in a
Hmm.
John Carpenter movie. They Live. It's turned up so many places. I thought I just want to put that in there without putting any quotation marks around it. Without like doing, you could make a movie about how many places that line has traveled to since that movie that was barely seen in 1972. And that's why
Right.
I thought just to have that in an opening montage to show that, and just to show this is part of foundationally how much our culture has been looted. And I'm so go ahead. What are you going to say?
But I say that because in the defensiveness that I met with, there was a sense, well, what is culture? How do you define that? And how do you define culture in such a way that it is not essentialist, though, and say, well, this is black and this is not. And the response that I got from those who were resisting was, well, we all are mixing and mingling. And I kept wanting to bring in history that nobody wanted to look at because remember, we're in a post George Floyd anti-critical race theory, anti-racism, so we can't really talk about history. So how do you talk about that? Because you called it out. You said this is part of white supremacy, and that is a word that is scary to, as Toni Morrison says, white people who are not examining their own um,
Privilege.
issues with race. Yes.
Yes.
How do you talk to people about that and maybe you don't waste your energy trying to talk to people about what white supremacy is in the context of cultural appropriation and cultural colonialism.
Well, it's for those who aren't made immediately defensive by it. And there are lots of people who are. And it becomes a way to well, say, if you control the means of production and the means of distribution, that is de facto supremacy.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's Karl Marx would call that supremacy. It's not me.
Oh
So,
goodness, now you're getting into the socialist Marxist stuff, and that makes you a leftist thug.
absolutely, I'm proud of
Oh. Well,
it.
well, I can tell you, I was not proud of it when I got a racist. Although, as Toni Morrison said, it's become data now because I know that what I was saying is true, and the truth hurts. And thank you for calling it out because that cultural appropriation is the hardest thing for people to get. Especially when we're trying not to be essentialists and say, well, this is black and this is not. But we know what it is. We know what it is. And we also know historically when something has been stolen and we've not been given credit for it. And one of the reasons we don't know is because people have taken it and they boxed it up and called it theirs when in fact it wasn't. Betty
Yeah,
Boop.
but again, when you're in control of the message and the delivery of the message, once you
Mhm,
take, that's why I use a line in the movie at one point. There's a de facto black underground, a
mhm,
cultural and economic underground that for so long was essentially ours. And then once it sort of steps into the mainstream and it's
mhm,
framed by somebody who gets to sort of claim it, then
mhm,
it's not ours anymore. And that's,
mhm.
I'm hoping the movie speaks to the danger of that. And,
Yes.
and you've been asking so many great questions about this, Neal, that I just find
Mhm,
myself thinking that I'm glad you saw the movie because I do want it to be both a cultural and a social document. It's
mhm.
about all those things because
It is all about
you can't absent, thank you, what's considered to
that.
be entertainment or art, which is about sort of talking about these things that make us idiosyncratic but all the same. You can't separate art from black art. And that's why I want to end the film too with Killer of Sheep because to me that's the moment of hope.
Right.
That even though a lot of these movies have come and gone, Killer Sheep is still being quoted. And Charles Burnett, who is truly an artist, who has made films, he brings the Italian neo-realist movement to the inner city in Los Angeles. I mean,
Mhm.
something that, in the abstract, people have told you was not possible. But if you've been in the south of France or the south of Italy, you've seen a lot of ways it's just like the south here. They eat lard, they call it lardo, they charge you $30 more for it. And all these kinds of things.
Right.
There's something that unites us that I'm hoping these kinds of conversations and hopefully the kind of conversation that the movie will provoke will get us to talk about this in ways that don't make people feel so threatened. And that's why if it's couched in entertainment, you just asking people to ask questions, not even come to
Right.
conclusions,
Right.
just to ask questions, which clearly that's what you do too.
But you're also taking this history and doing what is often not talked about or demonstrated, is that you are making a declaration that is also about joy, though. And there's so many ways in which that joy has been stifled or aborted because we're so in the everyday violence and trauma of things. And I love when you say, we are here, we create culture, we have voices, we will be heard. That is as much a declaration as potentially a threat to folks or a challenge to folks. That you, as Beyonce would say, you are not going to break my soul. And that's what I get from this. And it's the same sort of feeling. So I'm glad that John invited me to participate in this, because it feels very joyous that you watch this evolution, but you have come out on the other side of this saying, my grandmother was right. And from that aspiration and inspiration, this is what I have produced in response to that. Is that the Black joy that you would want people to experience and to emerge from your piece?
Gee whiz, I could not have possibly put this any better myself, because I do want that sort of third eye that being an African American in this country forces you to exercise. First of all, if you can't get through this existence without feeling some joy, despite the many obstacles that are placed physically and figuratively against us,
Mm-hmm.
then you wouldn't have created what we created. We had created a culture. I mean, there's no Rolling Stones without Black people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well,
there's so much. I mean, we could do this all day long between the two of us. There's so much that comes from Black culture. But what I want to show, happens so often from Black artists, is that there's no point sitting around wringing your hands, or else you wouldn't do anything but have bones left, because your fingers would be gone. You either move on and create, or you're weighed down by it. And that's not in us, is it?
Right. No, it's not, because we don't have the option of doing that. In fact, I go back to a conversation that I had at dinner with Toni Morrison, where she says there's no such thing as unsuccess or failure. If you've learned something from it, then that is data. And you are taking the data about all these ways in which representations and misrepresentations have emerged to actually create a space of joy that is first about validation. Even when somebody else didn't see it, and I'm going back to Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, that I'm not invisible because I don't exist. I'm invisible because you refuse to see me. And what you are doing is, there we are with Pecola again, and Polly in The Bluest Eye, particularly Polly, who's going to movie theaters trying to find herself and ignoring her Black family because she sees herself in old Hollywood, or is reminded of her position in the white family that she works for as a subservient position. So that's a very powerful image, and I'm glad to hear that you had a Morrison connection there too.
Well, whenever she said this stuff to me about failure, I'm sorry, what did you say to me, Miss Nobel Prize?
She says there's no such.
I know she said, when she said it to me, I'll go, yeah. What was that, Miss Nobel Prize winner? I'm sorry, we have different ideas of what success and failure are.
Well, I choose from that as data. That's what I choose to take it away from. I'm also curious about this notion that you put in there about Hollywood. White folks can tell other stories better than the minoritized folks telling their own stories. That's my paraphrasing of this. That is still true today, though. I think of that in terms of this denial that racism exists. Remember, we had that brief illusion that once Obama was elected, we were post-race. Once George Floyd's murder was out, we were ready to have a racial reckoning. But yet imagining this. In fact, let me just give you, I have been accused recently, having been on that show, pimping victimization. What do you say about that in terms of, this pimping or perceived pimping of victimhood? Because I don't see that.
Gosh, if you finish laughing at something like that ridiculous notion of pimping victimhood. I mean,
yeah,
it's at a certain point you get people to sort of accept responsibility. And by, or at least understanding where responsibility lay. And that's not saying that they're personally responsible, but there's certainly elements of institution, the behavior that's responsible for this. And that's why I want to stick in that line from The Spook Who Sat by the Door that Sam Greenlee took from Invisible Man, which is a Black man with a mop and a pail is invisible. And maybe rather, a Black man with a mop and pail can go anywhere, and a smiling Black man is invisible.
Yes. Oh my gosh, I love that. Yeah, that's my new favorite quote now. Right. Any place with a mop and a broom, but put on and a suit and tie for this white person would be, dressing to go to the Ritz. but a suit and tie for a Black person is a subservient role. And I can't tell you how many times I've been in a suit and a tie at a fancy event and somebody asked me to get them something to drink. Now I'm at the event like they are at the event.
You and me both. Excuse me, do you know where the bathroom is?
Yes.
I give
Well,
up. Is that a riddle or a question?
Or do you work here? I'm like, I'm here shopping just like you are. Where does that come from? But you have to smile. And that's what I started asking too. Is that Black enough for you now? That first of all, I said, I don't work here, or is that Black enough for you because I'm the Black person who's, doing stuff and you assume that I'm working here. So see, we could talk for days about this. I do want to ask though, because I know our time is winding. I want to talk about the music and the soundtracks, because you make a very important point that I had never really thought much about in terms of the ways in which the soundtracks and the movies help promote a lot of movies that we've come to recognize as Black classics today. So maybe you can talk, and then how white America just sort of borrowed that strategy.
I'm sorry, you're looking for the word
air quotes.
The phrase cultural imperialism again?
Yeah, talk to us about that, because people don't often think about that, I think.
It's a bit something that I recognize. And then when I got to talk to this guy I mentioned in the movie, the guy who had run Warner Brothers, and when I met him, he was running Sony Pictures. He goes, oh, yeah. It's because you can trace the line from Superfly to Saturday Night Fever to basically all the movies of the age. And they recognize you could use a soundtrack to move movies. And nobody thought about it in that way before. And it was kind of by inadvertence, because Superfly was released on Curtis Mayfield's label. Nobody had told him he was supposed to wait until after the movie came out. It comes out a few weeks early, and it's just such a big deal. It becomes, every time that the record is played, it's promoting the movie.
Right.
And then certainly when I was coming up just as a kid and I saw Saturday Night Fever, everybody goes, that's Shaft. I mean, there may be something lost on the greater culture, but Black people saw it and went, yeah, what else is there? They stole from us again.
Right.
And then for that message, that origin story to not be told, I just thought, well, that should be opened up for further conversation, because it's something that people, again, it's about the impact of cultural and social that these films had. And so that becomes this whole economic imperative that keeps the movies alive for another 20 years. The point of people saying, well, movies, nobody's going to any movies anymore and people aren't caring. Suddenly the soundtracks. I mean, is there a flash dance of the soundtrack? No. And is that doing the exact same thing? And then building these music videos out of the soundtracks, because the movies may be worthless, but there are songs in it. Then suddenly you can sell the movie just based on the song. Yeah, that becomes an undeniable and inviolable part of the Black contribution to popular culture and to movies.
Well, and I want to end on, or at least this idea here is, as I was watching and rewatching and listening and observing, I kept thinking of Ethel Waters' iconic singing of Darkies Never Dream. Did that enter into your thinking at all? Because it feels like it's so connected to what you're trying to do in a more nuanced way. Yes or no?
Oh gosh, absolutely. But what Baldwin talks about in The Devil Finds Work is the same kind of thing about that valley between dreams and what belongs to us and what we're told we should be dreaming about by virtue of not being included in the visualization of the dream. There's so much that runs through so much of Black culture. Yeah. And, as growing up and then hearing all these other things. So I felt like in some ways my grandmother was channeling something that was in the air for people of color. And I'm glad I got to live long enough to let people hear her words.
Well, you embraced it and you gave so much to think about. In fact, I reached out and I was like, okay, there's got to be a companion to this, because as I'm frantically writing down many movies, I was like, wait, is that what you want us to do? Because I need a companion to go to this so that I can know exactly what to watch when people are saying, okay, I need to catch up on my Netflix. This list should be there in the same way that the podcast list and all this came out after George Floyd's murder. People need this. I need this now. So I want the next thing to give me the movies. I'll create my own chronology of it, and then I'll look at the thematic ways. But these people need to see these movies, and they need to see your piece so that they know which movies to go to. You have done a wonderful job, an exciting way of bringing us into this moment of past and present through culture, through politics, through history, through film. And I want to, at this point, thank you for engaging me in this conversation. And I want to offer a special thanks to Netflix and Film at LACMA for this virtual screening and conversation. If you would like to watch again or share with friends and families, Is That Not Black Enough is now streaming on Netflix. Thank you very much.
My pleasure, Neal. Thank you.